When it comes to movies, they really don't make them like they used to, and normally I'd consider that a bad thing, but occasionally you hear stories so wild, so ridiculous and downright shocking from the so-called golden age of Hollywood that it makes you realise, yeah, maybe that's not such a bad thing after all. Such is the case with The Wizard of Oz, one of the most famous and iconic musicals of all time, a groundbreaking technical achievement that pushed the very boundaries of cinema, and according to the Library of Congress, the most watched movie in all of human history. But beneath the jaunty costumes and the Technicolor dance routines, there lies a sordid story of exploited actors, deadly accidents, abusive directors, literally toxic work environments, and fucking randy midgets. The making of The Wizard of Oz might be one of the wildest and most punishing productions in Hollywood history, and therefore, it makes a perfect episode of Production Hell. Our story begins way back in 1900 with the publication of the children's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It was a huge hit at the time, and with the rise of cinema, it wasn't long before people began experimenting with film adaptations. And holy shit, did they milk this one. Long before Judy Garland ever put on the ruby slippers, there had already been 7 different productions of The Wizard of Oz. And we think we've got it bad with remakes. Anyway, the success of Snow White in 1937 convinced MGM that there was still lots of money to be made by adapting children's books, and so they decided to have another bash at The Wizard of Oz. This one would prove to be their biggest production yet, with big musical numbers and the use of Technicolor for the first time in a major motion picture. It would give the film an iconic look for sure, but it would also create a lot of problems that we'll get into shortly. Anyway, after going through 11 different writers, the script was finally ready and casting began. The studio wanted Shirley Temple for Dorothy since she was the biggest child actor of the time and she was much closer in age to the actual character, but she was already contracted to 20th Century Fox, so they eventually settled on 16-year-old Judy Garland instead. Ray Bolger was originally cast as the Tin Man, but decided that he wanted to be the Scarecrow instead, and eventually convinced executives to let him swap places with Buddy Ebsen, who was playing Scarecrow at the time. Gail Sondergaard was originally cast as the Wicked Witch, but when they changed the character from glamorous and beautiful to the ugly green thing we see in the finished product, she was like, nah, fuck this, and pulled out. Margaret Hamilton was brought in to replace her and had just 2 days to learn all her lines and prepare for the role before filming started. I mean, damn man, imagine knowing you'd been specifically cast because they needed someone ugly enough to play a witch. Oh well, worse things were in store for Margaret. Believe that. Anyway, the film also called for over 100 dwarf actors to be cast as Munchkins for the Oz sequences, which was a big deal at the time because actors of that stature weren't exactly getting bombarded with work. They were also getting paid the equivalent of $3,000 per week in modern money, which meant they had plenty of cash to burn. Keep that one in mind because it'll be important later. Anyway, with the cast and crew finally assembled and the massive production ready to go into action, shooting got underway in October 1938 with Richard Thorpe in the director's chair. Thorpe had a reputation as a fast and efficient director, able to get big productions in the can without wasting time, which was exactly what MGM needed for their biggest and most expensive gamble to date. Unfortunately, Thorpe's creative vision was, well, not quite what the studio had in mind. Judy Garland was dressed up in a blonde wig and heavy makeup in order to give the kind of big, exaggerated performance you'd expect from a stage production. Needless to say, it wasn't working out, and after reviewing the first couple of weeks of footage, the studio were so disappointed that they fired Thorpe on the spot. All his scenes would end up having to be reshot, and apart from a few production stills, absolutely nothing remains of this lost version of The Wizard of Oz. Veteran director Victor Fleming was soon brought in to replace him and immediately set about fixing Dorothy's character. The blonde wig and the baby doll makeup were ditched and Garland was told to act more like herself, a decision that almost certainly saved the movie. Unfortunately, that was the least of Fleming's problems. Remember Ray Bolger, who wanted to swap parts with Buddy Ebsen so he could play the Scarecrow? Well, that didn't work out too well for old Buddy, who inhaled so much of the aluminium dust from the Tin Man paint he'd been covered in that he went into toxic shock and had to be rushed to hospital, where he spent the next 2 weeks on emergency oxygen trying not to die. By this point his skin had turned blue and he could barely even stand up, but the studio weren't having any of that shit. They told me to get the hell back to work, he explained in an interview later in life. Clearly he wasn't coming back though, and so he was quietly replaced by Jack Healy, who was never told what had happened to his predecessor. Instead, the production altered the Tin Man makeup to try to avoid almost killing a second actor, but the new mixture caused a severe eye infection that also needed medical treatment. Damn, it's like the Tin Man character was fucking cursed or something. It wasn't exactly a picnic for the rest of the cast either. To make up for lost time, most of them were working 6 days a week, starting at 4 AM for makeup and costume fittings, and working right through until 7 o'clock or later. The Technicolor process was also causing problems because the film needed extremely bright light to work properly, resulting in temperatures that soared to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit most days. This was especially bad news for Burt Lahr, who was playing the Cowardly Lion. His costume weighed over 90 pounds and it was made from real lion fur, and it took so long to put on that he wasn't allowed to remove it even during lunch breaks. The makeup forced him to live on a liquid diet of milkshakes and soup, which eventually made him so sick that he could barely get through his scenes. Combine that with an extremely sweaty man trapped inside it for 12 hours at a time, and well, I think you can imagine where this one was going. Apparently the smell was so bad that cast and crew avoided him like the plague between takes. Margaret Hamilton wasn't having much fun playing the Wicked Witch either. One scene where she's supposed to vanish into thin air was done with a combination of trapdoor, smoke and pyrotechnic effects. Unfortunately, the timing got fucked up, the pyros went off too early and the trapdoor didn't work. The result? Well, she became the Human Torch for a few seconds and had to be rushed to hospital with 3rd-degree burns over most of her face and hands. It turns out that green makeup was also highly flammable, which only added to the problem. The studio even had the balls to call her at the hospital the next day and ask her if she was coming back to work.
You sure about that? You sure about that?
When she eventually did return after a 6-week recovery period, she was immediately asked to film another scene with similar effects, and funnily enough she was like, nah, fuck that boys. Instead, a female stunt double had to be used, and strangely enough the same exact thing happened again, and this time the stunt double had to be rushed to hospital.
Really?
Then there were the environmental hazards that might not have hurt anyone at the time, but just kind of make you go, ooh. Like in one scene where Dorothy and the lion fall asleep in a field and get woken up by falling snow, which looks lovely and peaceful on screen. The only problem is that the snow was made from fucking asbestos.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for them.
Even the Munchkins were kicking off. See, all that money was giving them ideas above their station, and before you could say, grow up, they were drinking, gambling, and having wild orgies at the hotel they were being put up in. As Judy Garland said in a later interview, they were little drunks. They got smashed every night and they picked them up with butterfly nets. It wasn't all fun and games though, as a lot of them tried to make a pass at Garland herself. Her husband Sid Luft wrote in his biography years later, they'd make Judy's life miserable on set by putting their hands under her dress. The men were 40 or more years old. They thought they could get away with anything because they were so small. Speaking of Judy Garland, the production process was just as much of a nightmare for her as anyone else. She was already doped up on a potent combination of stimulants to get her through the long working days, a common practice with child stars at the time which her mum apparently encouraged. Fucking mother of the year right there, guys. The studio also did everything they could think of to make her look smaller and younger, including binding her breasts and giving her diet pills to slim her down. Even that wasn't good enough, and she was often referred to as the little fat pig with pigtails by studio executives. As you can probably imagine, feeding a teenage girl a regular diet of powerful narcotics and prescription drugs, combined with sexual harassment, punishing work hours, and constant jokes about her weight wasn't doing her mental state any favours, and at one point she burst into hysterical laughter during a scene with the lion. The director Victor Fleming wasn't having any of that shit though, and slapped her across the face to snap her out of it.
Fuck.
She was apparently really good on her next take though. I mean, you would be, wouldn't you? Now, would it surprise you to know that Judy Garland would suffer mental health issues for the rest of her life and eventually died of an overdose at the age of 47? Because it probably shouldn't. Even during a time when on-set safety, actors' welfare, proper working conditions and reasonable hours were seen as optional extras instead of basic necessities, The Wizard of Oz was a particularly brutal shoot, and by the time filming finally wrapped in March 1939, 6 months after it began, cast and crew were completely burned out. Literally in some cases. In addition to the burn scars from her accident on set, Margaret Hamilton's skin had been dyed green by the copper used in the witch makeup and would stay that way for months afterwards. Ray Bolger was left with permanent facial scars after wearing the scarecrow mask for months on end. Judy Garland was by now hopelessly addicted to amphetamines, diet pills and caffeine and would struggle with it for the rest of her life. Even the dog playing Toto was sidelined with a broken foot after one of the actors stood on it. As for the Munchkins though, they had a fucking blast on that movie, man. Although it was praised for its technical achievements at the time, The Wizard of Oz would end up having a disappointing run at the box office and wouldn't turn a profit until it was re-released in the 1940s. But the more it was shown, the more its reputation grew, and these days it's regarded as one of the most recognisable and influential films ever made. But at what cost? This movie really was production hell of the highest order, and proof that they really don't make them like they used to, because in some cases, well, they absolutely shouldn't. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.